Hello and welcome to Wingin It, and welcome to the start of a new series of videos, Teal or No Teal, in which I'm going to be taking a look at all of the Teal powers introduced in the European expansion of Wingspan, sharing my thoughts on them and giving my tips and tricks on how to best use them in your games of Wingspan. So if you've played the European expansion at all, you will know we've got this new power colour being Teal powers, so yeah, alongside a bunch of new birds with powers of the existing colours that we know and love from the base game of Wingspan being brown, pink and white. Yeah, we've got this new colour Teal powers and they are round end powers, so yeah, they'll trigger at the round end, and there's a bunch of different types of powers here, whether it's going to be caching food, laying eggs, tucking cards, or sometimes even being able to gain additional points by playing more birds. There's a whole lot of different kind of powers to choose from. And they really do bring a lot of new strategy options to the game of Wingspan. So some of them can be quite tricky to work with, particularly I think if you are a newer or less experienced player. But there's some really high ceilings here with some of these powers. So yeah, what I'm going to do in this series, I'm going to go through each type of power in turn, give my thoughts on them, give my little tips and tricks on how to best use them. And yeah, look for the situations where they can be best used and find synergies with other birds in the game so that you can really maximize the potential and score a lot of points. So in this first episode of Teal or No Teal, we're going to be taking a look at my personal favorite of the Teal powers, and that is the Teal PABs. PAB in this case being short for Play Another Bird. So yes, these are the three birds in the European expansion, being Maltoni's Warbler, the White Wagtail and the Yellowhammer. And they let you play an extra bird at the end of each round if you fulfill certain conditions. So yeah, of course, in Wingspan, we all know you only get those 26 turns, so you are limited in terms of how many turns you can use to gain resources and ultimately play birds and try and score points. But if you use these birds effectively, you can get up to 4 extra turns, and that is a huge increase on the number of turns that you're getting in the game. Just playing those extra birds at the round end can really help you not just set up that engine that little bit quicker in the early game, but also later on in the game get those really big point bombs down, maybe get yourself some more bonus cards as well, and yeah, potentially fill the board, which as we all know is definitely an exciting achievement to be pulling off in Wingspan. So these are particularly strong birds in my opinion, but they are also some of the hardest to work with. So yeah, these are ones that I do see newer or less experienced players struggle with quite often when they're trying to play with them, because yeah, they do require quite specific setups sometimes. And you do, of course, if you're going to be playing extra birds, you're going to need not only more bird cards, but also more food and potentially more eggs as well to be getting those birds down. So yeah, you need a lot of resources. It is quite a high cost setup to be going with. But as I say, if you're able to do that, then the payoff can be really huge, because just getting all those extra birds down, you can really be scoring a lot of points. So how do these birds work? Well, as I say, we've got 3 of them: the Maltoni's Warbler, the White Wagtail and the Yellowhammer, and they've all got the same power, and that is if you take all 4 types of actions in a round, you get to play another bird at the end of the round, paying its normal food and egg costs. So yeah, as I say, you only have 26 turns in Wingspan, and those are precious turns that in some cases you are going to be using to play birds. But if you can get extra birds down at the end of a round without having to use a turn to do that, that's going to save you turns. You can then use those turns that you're saving to maybe play even more birds, or of course gather some extra resources or score more points by running an engine. So yeah, more turns, more points. Seems pretty straightforward, but as I say, it is quite tricky sometimes, because you do have to fulfill that condition, being take all 4 types of action. Now, of course, in the early game, specifically that first round, you have 8 turns. And so 8 turns to do 4 different kinds of things, you've got a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility. But the downside to that is, of course, in the early game, you're not gaining that many resources. So maybe you're drawing cards and you're only actually drawing 1 card, or maybe you're gaining food and you're only gaining 1 food. That is not going to be enough to play loads and loads of birds. So yeah, you do for sure need some extra birds in those habitats to be able to get you extra resources. So yeah, of course, as well, laying eggs, you only get 2 eggs. If you're going to be playing extra birds, you're going to need more eggs. So just in general, lots and lots of extra resources are needed in that early game. But equally, they can be quite tricky to work with in the late game because that is where turns are at a premium. So of course, round 4, you only get 5 turns. And so if you know that 4 of those turns, I'm going to have to play a bird, I'm going to have to gain food, I'm going to have to lay eggs and draw cards, that's only 1 extra turn to play with, whether that's going to be doing one of those additional actions again. So yeah, your flexibility is definitely very limited. And certainly from the base game of Wingspan, we're all very much used to getting to that late game in the final round and just laying lots of eggs or maybe playing a couple of big point birds. It's not often that you'd really want to be drawing cards and then gaining food, because often those turns are not scoring many points. So they definitely can be tricky to work with in all rounds, I think. But as I say, that allure of being able to play an extra bird is very, very tempting and can help you score a lot of points. So now we know how those birds work, we're going to talk a little bit about where best to use them and kind of how to really spot whether it's a good situation or a bad situation for these birds. Because yeah, if there were situational birds in the base game, these birds are even more situational than many of those, I would say. So yeah, there are going to be cases here, maybe particular starting hands or particular setups that you've got going, where getting one of these 3 birds down would just be absolutely perfect and would very seamlessly fit in with what you're doing. And yeah, being able to actually use those and activate the powers is not going to be too difficult. But equally, there are going to be other situations where it's just not the right bird. They're not going to fit. Maybe your resource generation isn't high enough, or maybe you've got a very natural engine elsewhere in another habitat and you just want to run that and score points. So yeah, there are going to be cases where playing this is not going to be the best idea. But equally, as I say, there are lots of opportunities here to score extra points. So being able to spot when is the right situation and when is the wrong situation to go for this kind of bird is really key. And yeah, being able to recognize that and being able to then maximize off that is going to really help you maximize the potential of these birds and score lots of points. So we will start here by looking at some of the requirements that I think you need to bear in mind when looking to play one of these 3 birds. And the first of those is generating resources. So yeah, we all know Wingspan resource generation is already so important, but when you're looking to play even more birds in the game at the end of each round, resource generation has never been more important than it is here. So yeah, obviously if you want to play more birds, you're going to need more food, but you're going to need to be drawing lots more cards, because as we all, I'm sure, have had experience in Wingspan, you can draw cards and draw cards and draw cards and not find good stuff to play. So it almost doesn't matter if you get those extra plays at the end of each round. If you've not got good stuff to play, it's really not going to be worth using in those cases. So yeah, being able to make sure that you can find the good birds, but then also make sure you're generating enough food at the same time in order to be playing those kind of birds is really, really key. And yeah, I've seen many a situation where players try to use one of these 3 birds, but they're really lacking in one or more of those resource areas. And it is just such a struggle. And of course, while you're getting those extra turns at the end of each round, you're kind of really slowing down tempo by having to spend extra turns gaining those resources. So yeah, you can often find that the cost of using these kind of birds is going to be more than the payoff that you get at the end of it. So what's the best way to mitigate that? Well, of course, it is going to be to play these birds that let you get extra resources. So yeah, ordinarily in Wingspan, certainly when you're looking at the base game, we talk a lot about off-habitat resources. So whether it's going to be a chipping sparrow that gets you eggs in the forest, or a hummingbird that gets you food in the wetlands, there are many of these kind of birds that will let you generate extra resources from a separate habitat. And as I say, in the base game, that can be the key to winning, is being able to ignore one of the habitats, focus on using just 2 of the habitats and generating all 3 of your resources from there. That is going to save you turns and let you score more points. However, of course, when you're using these teal powers, you need to take all 3 types of actions. And so if you're underdeveloping one of those habitats, you're essentially wasting that turn. So you're getting a free turn at the end of the round. But if you're having to waste a turn with a really, really weak action each round, you're kind of offsetting that benefit that you would be gaining off that. So yeah, really, I think the key here is to be able to make sure you've got something in each habitat that gets you some kind of resource. It almost doesn't matter what. But actually, this is a case where having the same type of resource in that habitat can be really, really useful. So I'm thinking birds like the Wilson Snipe or the Spotted Sandpiper in your wetlands to get you extra cards. That just means I probably only need to spend 1 turn each round drawing cards because I'm going to get some extra cards there. I'm not going to have to worry too much about drawing too many more extra turns, and I can use those other turns for doing other things. One of those other things might be gaining food. This is one of the few situations where I would say something like a hummingbird or a towhee or a phoebe in the forest is actually a really good play. Now, of course, again, in the base game of Wingspan, I would say those birds are almost always better in another habitat, either the grasslands or the wetlands if they can go there. I wouldn't often be putting something like a hummingbird in the forest because I'm already getting food there. But of course here, with these teal powers, I know I need to be gaining food, and so if I can get that a little bit more food, and I am doing that, that can be a really good option. And similarly, other birds that I often do not like to play are birds such as the Western Meadowlark, which let you gain extra eggs when you are laying eggs. So for me, in the base game, or when you're running a Grasslands engine, these are not really good birds to look out for because you're already laying lots of eggs. You know, egg space is a big problem in Wingspan, which is why those birds with high egg capacity come at such a premium. And so, yeah, when you're laying eggs and already filling up, and then filling up even more from some of those brown powers, that can be really, really difficult to work with. But yeah, in these kind of games where you've got a Maltese Warbler or a White Wagtail or a Yellowhammer, you don't want to be laying eggs too many turns because you know you've got to spend some of those extra turns playing birds, gaining food, and drawing cards. So yeah, if you can get a bunch more eggs when you are laying eggs, you're not going to worry about filling up. So yeah, something like a Meadowlark, or the best case scenario here would be a red-legged partridge, also from the European expansion. You can get so many extra eggs when you are laying eggs. And again, if that's going to save you turns and let you spend extra turns gaining the required food, or maybe drawing cards again to be able to use these kind of powers, that is going to be really, really beneficial. Now, another key thing to consider when you are playing these birds is that you are going to need to be planning a lot more what you're going to do with your turns. So it's something that I already would recommend to newer or less experienced players, particularly in that early game. You should be planning out your first round and thinking, okay, what order am I going to do things in? Am I going to play this bird first, or am I going to draw cards, or maybe get some food? It's always key to think about what you're doing, not just on this turn, but also planning ahead to that next turn. And again, with these birds, you need to be taking all 4 kinds of actions in the round. So you should really be planning and making sure you don't want to get to that last turn of the round and finding that you have to lay eggs because you haven't already done it. Being able to do those actions earlier in the round and then giving yourself flexibility to react later in the round. Maybe a nice bird pops up in the tray, or maybe the feeder gets reset in a position where the exact food that you need is there ready to be gained. Giving yourself that flexibility, as I say, in that early game is key, but again, in that late game, making sure you know if you've only got 5 turns in the final round and you know what 4 of those turns are going to be, think about what that spare turn, that 5th and final turn is going to be. Is it going to be playing another bird? Is it just going to be laying eggs and scoring points? Being able to plan ahead and being able to really think carefully about what you're going to do with each turn so that you make sure not only that you're maximizing those turns, but also making sure you can use these teal powers at the round end. That's really, really important. Another consideration to make when deciding to work with these birds or not is what kind of birds you're able to play with them. So, of course, there are going to be some good synergies that you can get here with these teal powers. Many of those are also teal powers that we are going to be looking at later in this series. So yeah, there are some powers there that let you lay extra eggs, and of course those are going to be useful for playing more birds. There are some that let you gain food, again obviously very, very useful for playing extra birds. So yeah, some real good synergies there between teal powers that I think we will definitely be looking at later in this series. But equally, there are plenty of other birds that don't have teal powers that I really do look to go for when I'm working with a Maltese Warbler or a White Wagtail or a Yellowhammer. And those are birds that don't have any food cost. Now often that can be the real tricky thing when you're working with these birds, is being able to get enough food to play them, because quite often you want to be playing those big point birds later in the game, or they're going to cost 3 food, and if you can't get the exact food you need, sometimes if you have to do a bit of overpaying, it can cost 4, 5 or more food. So those can be really tricky to get down if you don't quite have enough food production going but that is where those free birds come in play. So yeah, something like a California condor that ordinarily I don't really like, I would be quite happy to see if I'm playing with these birds, because I know I don't have to worry about food. I can play that for free at the end of the round. I'm just going to have to pay the egg cost potentially, and it will get me a bonus card, which if I'm playing lots of birds, I'm only going to be scoring even more points from that bonus card. So that's a particularly good synergy. Also, another one to think about are those predator powers in the European expansion that you play on top of other birds. So these kinds of powers I see getting a lot of hate from players who maybe just don't quite understand the potential there in these kind of powers. Of course, they are very, very situational. Not the kind of bird that I would lean on all the time, but for sure, if I can get to that final round and if I can play a red kite on top of another bird for free, maybe I've got Rodentologist bonus card, Falconer, Omnivore, Specialist, and I'm going to get even more points from playing that. So again, not costing any food, potentially getting more points, maybe from a bonus card as well. These kind of birds, I think, are really, really good. And of course, it kind of goes without saying, but something like a Benelli's Eagle, or an Eastern Imperial Eagle, or even just a Northern Goshawk or a Eurasian Sparrowhawk, being able to use some of your extra cards, if you've got them, at the end of the game, and play those birds for free after you've taken your last turn at the end of the 4th round. Yeah, that is just such a power move. And again, it kind of goes without saying that these are good birds to play, but for sure, linking up with these teal powers make them even better, in my opinion. Another synergy to consider with these kind of powers, and it is one that I have just touched upon, is going for lots of bonus cards. So yeah, it kind of goes without saying, but bonus cards, they're going to score you points if you can get the right birds down. More birds down, it means more chances of being able to fulfill those bonus cards. So yeah, if you've got a board that's only got 7 or 8 birds down and you're trying to draw a bonus card late in the game, chances are you're not going to be able to hit that just because you haven't got enough birds down. But if you're using one of these teal powers and you've got 13, 14, even 15 birds down, if you're able to fill the board, you give yourself such a huge chance of hitting the jackpot on a bonus card burden. Again, if you're going to go for even more bonus cards, maybe you get 4 or 5 at the end of the game, and you're scoring 6 or 7 points from each of those, that is a huge score on bonus cards. And in some cases, it can be game winning. So yeah, being able to consider going for more bonus cards, it's obviously a gamble, but I think when you're able to play extra birds, in this case, it's a little bit of a safer gamble. So certainly something to consider. I'm definitely more likely to go for a bonus card play if I know I've got one of these 3 teal powers on the board and I'm going to be getting plenty more birds down as the game progresses. So we've taken a look at some of the positive sides of these birds and of course gone through some situations where they work well and some of the positive synergies you can get with other birds. But it is important to consider that these are not always going to be the best option to play. So as I said, definitely situational birds, and as many good situations as there are going to be some bad situations as well. So where should you not look to play these birds? It's definitely where you've already got a strong engine in one of the habitats. So yeah, maybe you've got a really good forest going, where you've already got a wood duck or a chipping sparrow or polluted woodpecker, or you're just going for lots of cached food. That's the kind of situation where one of these 3 birds is probably not going to help you out that much, because you're going to be just wanting to gain food and maybe get some cards or get lots of cached food or some eggs as well. You're not going to really need to worry about running those other habitats, and so playing one of these birds is just going to slow you down. And of course the same applies to any other habitat in the game. So if you're going for a really strong grasslands engine, maybe you've got a killdeer, Franklin skull or a white stork, or you've got some ravens or some crows down that are going to get you extra cards or food. If you're already getting cards from your grasslands, you're not going to want to draw cards from the wetlands. And if you're already gaining food from your grasslands, you're not going to want to gain food from your forest. So again, playing these birds, really in that situation, it's not the way to go. I think I would always much rather focus on the engine I've got set up and trying to use that to gain resources, but of course score points while I'm doing that. Another situation where I really wouldn't look to be playing one of these 3 birds is where I'm lacking in one or more of the 3 key resources, being food, eggs, and cards. So yeah, again, did touch upon this a little bit earlier when looking at the positives of these birds and really talking about how important it is to be able to generate plenty of additional resources to be able to play these birds. But so many times I will see a player try and force one of these birds into their strategy when they don't have a good enough card access or they don't have a good enough food access. And as I say, that is really the key to being able to play extra birds with these powers at the round end, is having enough resources. And food, I think, is the most important one, of course. Whenever you're playing a bird, it only costs you 1 card, but often can cost you 2 or even 3, or even more food again if you're having to overpay. So food is often the limiting factor here. And yeah, plenty of times I will see players try and use these birds when they just don't have the forest setup, or they don't have the food generation required. And in those cases, you're going to be spending so many extra turns gaining food that you're almost offsetting that benefit of the additional turn you get at the end, because you're just wasting turns, taking just 1 or 2 food at a time, particularly in the early game, and not really getting anywhere. So yeah, it's important to consider, especially in a starting hand. If you've got one of these 3 birds, look at the other birds in your starting hand and think to yourself, can I generate enough resources from these other birds to be able to sustain using these Teal PABs throughout the game? Because hopefully you can, but there are going to be situations where you can't, and you're kind of really painting yourself into a corner almost by trying to use these powers when you haven't really got the setup around it to support it. The last thing that I would consider as a potential drawback, and certainly something that you should be thinking about when deciding whether or not to play these birds, is, do I have enough time to use them? So of course, in a lot of these situations we've been talking about the early game, maybe getting one of these in a starting hand. But there are of course going to equally be some situations where you draw this maybe in round 2 or 3, and you've got to work out for yourself, can I get enough benefit from using these birds? So my kind of rule of thumb is, if it's round 1 or 2, absolutely, there is enough time. Even in that second round, if I know I've already got some good card access going, and particularly, as I say, some good food access, I'd quite happily get one of these birds down, because it takes 1 turn to play it. But if that's going to get me 3 additional turns at the end of each of the remaining rounds to play extra birds, that's still a net positive gain of a couple of turns. So yeah, that is definitely going to be worth playing, in my view, if you have got the infrastructure to support it. But it's where it gets to round 3 that it becomes a little bit more tricky, I think. For sure, round 4, almost not worth it for me, because you take a turn to play it, and then you're only getting 1 free turn at the end. So you're kind of at a net 0 there in terms of whether you're actually gaining anything from that. And then yeah, round 3, if you do play it, you get those extra 2 turns. But as I said before, those final 2 rounds, particularly round 4, can be really, really tricky to work with these powers, because you know 4 of your turns are predetermined, and so you only have 1 extra turn for doing stuff in that last round. And quite often, again, you don't want to be drawing cards, you don't want to be gaining food, you want to be laying eggs, and you want to be playing big point birds. So yeah, round 3, it's very situational, it's very tricky to judge, but certainly I would say round 2 or before, that's when these birds are going to be best played, and after that, there are probably going to be better options. So there we go, those are my top tips and tricks, and looking at the pros and cons of these 3 Teal PABs, the Maltese Warbler, the White Wagtail, and the Yellowhammer. So as I said, I really like these birds. I will try and play with them whenever I get the opportunity, if they come up in a starting hand, and more importantly, if I have got the resource support to really be able to use these most effectively. I'm going to go for it. I think it's a really fun way of playing Wingspan, but not just that, it is a really high ceiling, as I say, in terms of scoring lots and lots of points by getting those extra birds down. So yeah, I've got a few videos on this channel. Equally, I've got some previous live streams that you can go check out, where I talk a little bit more in depth as I'm playing about the usage of these birds and the specific situations that they're in. But yeah, hopefully this video has been a useful overview, and can give you confidence maybe next time you see one of these birds to assess the situation and work out, yes, okay, I am going to play this, and I'm going to be able to score a lot of points in doing so. So yes, thank you for watching. Of course, this is part 1 of a series of videos in which I'll be looking at all of the Teal powers included in the European expansion. So if you want to stay up to date and see the future parts of those, and really understand in depth more of the Teal powers, and look at some of those synergies you can get between them, then please do hit that subscribe button and stick around and stay tuned. Plenty more videos coming your way.